Thank you very much, Dragan. This is my fuel. I hope I'll be able to finish this talk. Well, we'll see. Hope it won't be too painful for you, of course. Thank you very much. It's an honor. It's a pleasure. I think that in 2 days' time I'll have left you, so I'll do my best to leave with a good memory of that night. Allow me to read for those among you, and I know that there are quite a few who understand French, a quotation from Victor Hugo, which I found some time ago. But I already knew, of course, that I would be talking in the framework of this conference. These are 2 verses from Hernani, Acte 1, Scène 4. Not very good, actually. Un poignard à la main, l'œil fixé sur ta trace, je vais. Ma race en moi poursuit en toi ta race. I thought it was almost a miraculous coincidence. I thought that I should take advantage of this invitation to return to certain interrogations that have surfaced here and there in my previous attempts at discussing the issue of racism or other issues that are related with the phenomenon and the notion of racism, such as universality, violence, or boundaries and identities. I will do it in a manner that has to be elusive, therefore too abstract, and that for want of the new investigations which should be or would be necessary, will remain hypothetic and fragile, perhaps arbitrary. But I'm encouraged to do so by the memory of the many occasions in which already you have accepted to hear and discuss similar considerations, which is not so surprising after all, since they owe everything directly and indirectly to the discourses and writings of many friends who have gathered in this place today. And among these friends, the first of all, chronologically speaking at least, is also one of my dearest and most admired masters. I'm sure that Jacques Derrida will recognize easily tonight the deep imprint of some of his ideas and formulations on 1 or 2 points of my discourse. I don't know if he will approve of it, but whether he chooses or not to articulate his own intervention in these terms, I will remain extremely happy that our reflections on a subject of such importance and difficulty are brought together by virtue of our simultaneous presence in Irvine and his generous acceptation to be my respondent. I will address 4 questions which, it seems to me, cover a range of difficulties, perhaps insuperable aporias. I have no intention of getting rid of them, but I want to discuss their relevance and try their formulation, express my doubts and my hypotheses with one basic idea in mind: to show not so much how philosophy can theorize racism or include it as one of its objects and domains, but rather why it is the case that racism, starting with the name from which it is called, disturbs philosophy, disturbs the speaker as well, disturbs philosophy and puts it into question. I will not sketch another philosophy of racism, and in fact, I don't think that there are so many of them. But I will try to have the issues of race and racism determine the very orientation of philosophical discourse. The first 2 questions, preliminary if you like, will be more epistemological or metaphysical. They concern the discourse of race as an expression of the desire of knowledge and a procedure of representation of the constitutive divisions of the human species, and consequently the relationship between the issue of race and the possible definition of philosophy as an anthropology. The next or last two questions will be more historical and political. They concern the symmetries and even what we might call perhaps the invariant character of the antithetic theological and biological references of the discourse of race, which form the, the apparent link between pre-modern discriminations and modern racism, as it was generalized in the era of European nationalism and Eurocentric colonial seizure of the world, and they concern the extent to which this symmetry, for which I have chosen to make use of the terms election and selection, can still help us understand the tendencies of what many consider to be a neo-racism or a post-racism of the era of globalization, characterized by the tensions of international migrations and the obsession with so-called clashes of civilization. In the end, I will try to combine these different approaches to introduce the difficult ethical issue of an alternative to the discourses and practices of race and racism, which I call the other of racism, in order to show how indeterminate it must remain in its ultimate objectives, although we would certainly consider that the racial or racist formations call urgently for initiative and action in the fields of education, social justice, international civility, and so on. Let me begin with a first aporia which concerns the relationship between the problem of racism and the problem of knowledge. In a previous occasion, trying to explain that the relationship between universalism as a normative representation of universality predicated upon the community of human beings and racism as a representation of differences and hierarchies within this very same species can never be pure and simply a relationship of incompatibility. I had spoken of the profound desire of knowledge that is also embodied in racist discourse. What I had in mind was basically the fact that racism describes, in an abstract or idealizing manner, types of humanity, and the fact that it makes extensive and, in a sense, creative use of classifications which allow individuals and groups to imagine answers for the most immediate existential questions, such as the imposition of identities and the permanence of violence between nations, ethnic or religious communities. This was also a way to indicate that although relations of power and domination are constantly associated with racial discriminations or underlying them, the relationship between the social structures and the discourses cannot be conceived in pure instrumental terms. It is neither purely functional nor subordinate, but consists of active intellectual formations where the reflexive aspect is as important as the projective or stigmatizing one. This idea, which philosophically owes a great deal to the Nietzschean and Foucauldian notions of a will to truth and a will to knowledge, is not, I must confess, entirely clear in my own eyes, especially inasmuch as it seems to rely upon psychological analogies and therefore would perhaps be welcome by cognitive theoreticians of races and race relations today. But even so, it seems to me that it should be pushed further and associated with a radical critique of the idea of a scientific analysis of racism. Under its own name, as a discourse of race, or other metonymic names that we will retrieve, racism has become one of the major themes of sociology, history, social sciences in general, and it seems that this objectification of racism is basically an attempt to end racism in the double sense of putting an end to its metamorphoses and transformations by solving the riddle of its driving forces and of preparing its suppression according to, or in accordance with the enlightened scheme of an intellectual and pedagogical contribution to its practical critique, the practical critique of racism. In this respect, if we take a cavalier view of the evolution that has taken place in the last century, a strange substitution seems to have taken place. Whereas much of the social sciences, particularly under the influence of evolutionary biology and ethnography, was busy with discussing the importance and the consequences of race divisions and race relations, granting the concept of race a positive meaning and use, it is now mainly busy, the social sciences are now mainly busy with discussing the importance and practical consequences of racism, conceived as a product of the collective imaginary, a social or cultural phenomenon which permeates the self-consciousness of individuals and groups and has consequences, admittedly negative, on their internal and reciprocal behavior. In both cases, a meta-language is created which takes race and racism as empirical objects and describes them from an objective angle, but something like a Copernican revolution has taken place. It is no longer the alleged reality of race that is considered as an object of knowledge. It is its constitution as a representation or even fiction under certain conditions or as a consequence of certain causes and structures. It is widely believed that this shifting or revolution has been prompted by two sorts of converging causes. On the one hand, the destruction of the biological foundations of race that had dominated at least part of the racial discourse in the 19th and early 20th century by more recent genetic and evolutionary theorizing, although everybody knows that this biological foundation was a late development of notions that initially referred to genealogy rather than genetics. On the other hand, the impact of decolonization and other historical processes which either testified for the inhuman, murderous character of the race idea or allowed its victims to resist and challenge the object categories that were imposed upon them. But for our purpose, it is even more interesting, perhaps, to underline the constructivist revolution that accounts for the progressive substitution of racism for race as an object of scientific investigation. Let us put it in quasi-Sartrean terms by generalizing what Jean-Paul Sartre explained concerning the constitution of the Jew through the hostile and stigmatizing gaze of the others. Races exist only inasmuch as processes of racialization take place. They are the result of an imaginary construction which testifies for the existence of racist feelings or prejudices, racist groups, racist structures causing the invention of races or practical equivalents. Only one has to remark that this substitution can be interpreted in different ways, either historically, by suggesting that an imaginary attempt at describing races which believed to have scientific foundations has been, in the end, corrected and replaced by a genuinely scientific investigation of the forms and causes of racism, which is a progress on the road to knowledge, or politically, by suggesting that it is the racist, or it were the racists, who believed in the existence of race and sought to explain it, particularly with biological concepts, whereas the anti-racist or the victim of racism, who have obvious common interests, reject this notion and turn to the critical study of its invention and use. But in both cases, precisely, the study of racism can be viewed as a preliminary to its suppression and its end. Now, sorry. I want to suggest that this narrative is not very satisfying. Not only it falls short of explaining the metamorphoses of historical racism, its processes of recreation, both on the side of the objects and on the side of the discourse or the names, but it fails to explain the paradoxical effects of the fact that racism is not only, perhaps not primarily, an hetero-referential discourse directed at describing and conceptualizing the other, but a self-referential discourse. For instance, the fact that racialized groups, particularly black people, keep using the category of race or vindicate it in the very moment in which it is criticized by the social sciences, in order to protest politically and culturally against discriminations and make their claims visible, so to speak. This probably does not mean that the demand for objectivity has no meaning or no value, nor does it mean that nothing has been gained by uncovering psychological and social processes of the construction of the race category. But it might mean that nothing such as a meta-language can be reached, whereby the subject of the analysis of racism could put itself apart from the realm of its objects, that is, transcend it and anticipate its end. In a significant sense, while scientific and political criteria evolved, the status of the investigation remained the same. Both the discourse of race and the discourse of racism are attempts from inside, not from outside, at interpreting differences and conflicts, and the becoming conflictual, violent, sometimes murderous and genocidal of differences within the human species, or at interpreting the paradox of the non-communitarian character of the community in which they are themselves taken or caught. And they face the same ambivalence, namely the fact that the other and its otherness are investigated in order to account for the subject's own position within universality or humanity. But I think that I can be even more specific. What the dogmatic discourse of race and the critical investigation of racism have in common, or the common element that they have kept, in both cases, in the form of a claim to scientificity, is their relation to the question of the differentiation of mankind and its singular history. What the transition from race to racism testifies for, however, and I would agree that this is a progress, is the fact that the problematic character of the division of mankind among races or cultures or ethnicities has become self-conscious. We have become able to acknowledge that the paradoxes of this division, where we try to locate ourselves, which produce at the same time the communication and the incompatibility, or in another language, the necessity of translation and its impossibility, are not to be isolated from a singular history. I would prefer the term geohistory or geographic history, which is the history of the failed unification of mankind in the form of domination, exclusion, extermination, or the history of the emergence and the metamorphosis of a radical otherness associated with the processes of normalization, universalization, homogenization, identification of mankind. The historical narrative can become self-critical to some extent, but it cannot abstract itself from the desire of knowledge that arises from mankind being practically irreducible to its own universal idea, therefore strange, therefore also frightening. I want now to push this interrogation into another complementary direction that touches more specifically the internal relationship between the problem of racism and the problem of philosophy. The easy way would be to say that philosophy in its dominant language, but there are notable exceptions we know, is universalistic, that is based on a denegation of racism or on a moral and intellectual condemnation of discriminations, that also prevents the philosophers from being aware of the extent to which they themselves share racist prejudices or anti-Semitic or colonialist or Eurocentric assumptions, etc. This demonstration has been made repeatedly and to some extent convincingly in the case of Kant or Hegel or others. It is parallel to the demonstration that can be made concerning the nationalist prejudices of philosophers who claim to express a cosmopolitic point of view, or more interestingly perhaps, their sexist prejudices. But I would suggest that this is not the most interesting or determining level. My suggestion is that the issue of racism as a correlate of the representation of the impossible unity of mankind, or of the uneasy answer for whichever concrete individual or group to the question that it cannot but ask itself of what it means to be human or to belong to the community of human beings, directly touches the aporetic relationship between philosophy and anthropology. It forms perhaps the clearest expression of this philosophical dilemma. Philosophy is always centered on anthropological statements or enunciations, either in the form of definitions of the essence of man or the demarcation of human nature within nature in general, the properly human, or the moral and historical condition of man in the generic sense, however it can, or the moral and historical condition of man in the generic sense. However, philosophy can never uncritically coincide with such enunciations or statements. Again, this could be understood in the present through a retrospective historical and self-critical consideration that involves the uneasy distinction between an anthropological and a humanistic point of view, or the paradoxical possibility, I would say a limit possibility, of an anthropology that is or would not be humanist. The 20th century, or better said, the prolongation of the 19th century into the 20th, in politics but also in philosophy, will have been the era of racism, of its triumph, its catastrophes, but it will also have had extraordinary consequences concerning the apparently indissociable unity of anthropology and humanism. Every anthropological discourse is not humanist. That is, it does not define man or mankind or the human as the supreme value. If we admit that an anthropological question is there, as soon as it is a question in philosophy of enunciating the proper of man, the essence of man, we see that anthropology was formed in the horizon of cosmological and theological discourses, that is, in the perspective of locating and evaluating the possibilities of human thought and action from the point of view of the cosmic order or within the teleological sequence of a divine scheme or economy of salvation, etc. Anthropology, or philosophy as anthropology, remember the famous Kantian assertion, quoted and criticized by Heidegger, all the critical questions are summarized in the single demand, what is man? Becomes a humanist discourse when it is admitted that man as a species contains the conditions of possibility of the becoming human, the humanization of every single individual, or defines its practical goal. This is what Foucault has called the empirical transcendental doublet, where the human is instantiated twice, or is thought at the same time as constituent power and constituted existence, or empiricity. It means the presence or the immanence of the species, of the generic community of mankind within the individual, or still better, within the commerce, the interaction, the trans-individual relationship of individuals, which makes them precisely human, either as essence, always already there and therefore somehow real, or as capacity, virtuality, perfectibility, as Rousseau would say, that is a norm and an injunction that has to be realized in life or in history. The successive epochs of modernity, in particular the progressive expansion of the European model of rationality and the tragic outcomes of its world domination, have shown that the humanist conception of man as expression of its own essence or realization of its own project not only implies that differences and inequalities are justified in terms of unequal access to the full perfections of that model, but above all that exclusions from the typical social, intellectual, and political activities which form the complementary aspects of civilization are interpreted as virtual exclusions from the normal pattern of the human, under the names of barbarity, animality or infrahumanity, perversity, etc. One might draw the conclusion that it has marked the end of every possibility to think philosophically, including from an ethical point of view, within the horizon of anthropology. But I would argue that the result is slightly different. It is rather a paradoxical divorce of the anthropological question and the humanist perspective, inasmuch as it now appears that, in a sense, what is properly human is rather the possibility, the permanent possibility of the inhuman without pre-established limits, that is reached either in the dimension of cruelty, extreme violence, or in the dimension of artifice, self-instrumentalization, etc. But I would also argue that, that the possibility of the no, it doesn't want to come out. The possibility of the inhuman as properly human, or the contradictory association of self-construction and self-distraction of the relationship among human individuals, what I call the commerce or the trans-individual, is also closely related to the philosophical possibility of shifting the object of anthropological discourse from a consideration of essences, universal models, norms of humanity and civilization, to a consideration of something more elusive and more perturbing that we can call the anthropological difference, and whose identification is clearly haunting contemporary philosophy, sometimes deemed for that reason post-modern. At this point, I will ask Jacques Derrida's permission to make a detour through one of his analyses and borrow one idea from a presentation of his that has many simultaneous questions at stake. I'm thinking of the two complementary essays, very well known, called Geschlecht 1 and Geschlecht 2, with the respective subtitles Sexual Difference, Ontological Difference, and Heidegger's Hand, which form part of a continuous commentary of Heidegger's complex exposition of the originary possibilities or disponibility of Dasein, where the non-essence of man, or its radical openness to decisions and transformations, is thought as an ontological indetermination which precedes the very possibility of anthropology, that is, of particular determinations of the human as such. In French, these two texts are in the collection of essays called Psyché, Invention de l'autre, and in English I don't know, but I'm sure everybody here knows. Derrida takes advantage of the extraordinary polysemy of the German term Geschlecht, not only in Heidegger's texts, but in the German language in general, for which we are forced to recur to such different names as sex, or sexual difference, or race, or genre, or species. And he makes it a linguistic or poetic allegory of the simultaneous theoretical gestures that are performed by Heidegger in the same or neighboring discourses. On the one side, to maintain and reinforce a traditional metaphysical opposition between the human and the animal, or the humanity of the humans and the animality of the animals, which transforms the generic imago of the animal into the representation of absolute otherness for the human essence, therefore also the index of the degenerative process which threatens the human from the inside with absolute loss or denaturation. On the other side, to suggest, and these are the two simultaneous gestures of Heidegger, read by Jacques. On the other side, to suggest by means of an ambiguous and insistent reference to the powerful neutrality of the Dasein, or the neutrality that is powerful, or that is a power, with respect to the sexual binary difference of the masculine and the feminine, that there is an originary aspect of sexuality in which its possibilities or powers are not limited by the complementarity and the mirroring images of the genders or the sexes, inasmuch as they are two and only two, but are or would be intrinsically multiple, or as Freud would possibly say, polymorphous. This is my own edition. The meaning of Geschlecht as race appears then to obliquely design precisely this tension of this situation of double bind where the realization of the human is thought and feared as its perversion and its loss. Something like the idea that human originary sexuality could exist and realize itself as a multiplicity exceeding the normality of gender types and roles, but only at the risk of blurring the separation between the human and the non-human, which Heidegger calls animality. And it is precisely the necessity to avoid that risk that prevents Heidegger from completely admitting that the sexual difference is always already involved in the ontological difference, which in his case takes the place of the idea of the humanity of man as a transcendental principle. Now, I doubt, or I'm not sure, that Derrida would accept, in any case without critical qualifications, the expression anthropological difference that I have used myself. But I do think that we are here extremely close from that idea. The sexual difference is not per se the anthropological difference, but it exhibits what I myself take to be its basic characteristic, namely the fact that without such a difference, the human as such cannot be represented and thought, which derives a contrario from the fact that if you imagine this difference suppressed, the difference of the masculine and the feminine, or men and women, humanity is threatened, and practically. But also the fact that the difference is impossible to locate, since its equivocity or instability or multiplicity exceeds the possibility of binary, simple binary oppositions. In clear terms, you cannot think of the human without including the sexual difference of the masculine and the feminine as essential characteristic. But nobody knows and will ever know what are the limits of the masculine and the feminine, what it means to be a man or a woman, and even worse, whether he or she is himself or herself masculine or feminine, and in which sense or which proportion. The only possibility that you have to escape the uncertainty is to impose conventional emblems and forms of self-consciousness. But what holds for the sexual difference also, I think, holds for others. I don't believe that there are so many at the same level, but I'm not attempting either to build a closed list. For example, it holds for the difference of the healthy and the sick, or the normal and the pathological, and it holds for the distribution of intellectual, affective, and physical capabilities in different cultures or civilizations, and also among individuals. It would be hasty to deduce from such philological considerations that racism can be conceptualized from an anthropological point of view as a discursive and institutional reduction of the uncertainty or indetermination of anthropological differences by means of such mythical projections as an opposition between the realms of humanity and animality. But perhaps we could suggest the reverse formulation, that each time we have to do with historical racial formations which perform different functions in the framework of systems of domination, discrimination, or even extermination, we also find violent forms of generalization and normalization of basic anthropological differences. And I would suggest that this opens the possibility of an anthropological discourse, which to me is philosophy itself, where it is not a question of defining mankind or framing models of humanity and civilization in a humanist way, but of understanding the actual or virtual violence of the definitions themselves, which make use of such oppositions as masculine and feminine, strong and weak, spiritual or intellectual, and affective or sensual, healthy or sick, developed and degenerate, etc., in order to categorize human behaviors and ultimately human groups, human identities or processes of identification. It is in that sense that at the beginning I spoke of the necessity to consider racism not as an object or a particular problem on which universal categories are objectively applied, categories or methods, but as a constitutive question which reveals the ambiguous relation of philosophy and anthropology, placing philosophy at a crossroads, so to speak, either developing an essentialist discourse or ceaselessly questioning its possibility and its institutional power by interpreting the capacity of inhumanity that is involved in the very indeterminacy of the human or so-called human differences. I will now attempt a second form of generalization, but using a different method in this sense that I will have, always in a schematic, elusive manner, to abandon the seemingly atemporal and metaphysical style of these indications concerning anthropological differences and the violence of their institution, in order to allude to historical forms of this violence and their symbolic expression or justification. This is because I want to suggest that there are other symbolic projections and mediations as animality, that are involved in the construction of racial formations where race becomes associated with the distinction between the properly human and its imaginary other. But animality itself is certainly not a concept without its own history. And just as Derrida frequently insists on the fact that the animal as such does not exist, because there are as many differences among animals as among them all and the human animal, I would like to insist on the fact that animality, including in its projective function, which we might also call bestiality or vitality, is a concept with a history for which the racist applications or metaphors are not extrinsic but immediately revealing. This history, however, is certainly not linear. It is made of repetitions, of transferences, of translations, of new cathexes of the old schemes. I do not say that it is immemorial because I don't know anything of the origins, or rather I see the representation of the origins as one typical aspect of essentialization and categorization. The question of the point where the old images and schemes of the human and its limits become obsolete or have completely changed their meaning in history remains constantly open, and we will see in a minute that it has some particularly actual relevance. This being said, the enigma that never ceases to puzzle me is the following. It is an enigma, and I'm still hesitant, I must say, as for the extent to which its displaying as such can contribute to our understanding of racism, which is one of the reasons why I take this opportunity to present it. This enigma, this enigma has to do with the repetition or the trace of the old splitting of the representation of the inhuman between the two poles of the animal and the godly or the divine within the modern discourse of racism in the form of the two typical schemes of election and selection, if you prefer, elect nations and selected populations. But since I said in the beginning that we are ourselves caught in the construction of these representations, even when we try to make a critical use of them, and that we had better taking them not as universal explanatory categories, but as concrete figures in a given narrative, self-referential narrative, I will translate also the opposition between election and selection, or divine racism and animal racism, theological and biological foundations of human diversity, as opposition between the scheme and history of anti-Semitism and the scheme and history of whiteness. I readily admit that things are not quite as simple as that. While it is widely admitted that racism is a typically modern phenomenon associated with the construction of a racial state, as David Theo Goldberg would say, that is, at the same time, national, therefore nationalist, therefore exclusive of communities who do not fit or do not accept to adapt to the domination of the national identity, and colonial, therefore imperialist, therefore reducing the dominated and overexploited populations outside Europe, in the broad sense, to the condition of infrahumans who face a permanent choice between forced labor and extermination. It is also clear that racism is typically splitted among two kinds of discourses and formations which obey totally different logics. Anti-Semitism, especially if we take it in its general form, where not only the figure and status of the Jewish people is involved, but also, albeit with its own specificities, the relationship with Islam, is a secularized form of theological hatred within the history of Western monotheism, where a people or a group of people is hated discriminated, excluded, and in some cases exterminated because it represents the radical heterogeneity of the allegiance to the same God, which successively resists or obstacles, if only in successfully resists or obstacles, if only in a phantasmatic manner, the unity of the Christian people, and later the inclusion of this Christian people in the secularized corpus mysticum of the nation state, or the political religions of nationalism. I always quote in this respect the extraordinary composed word invented by the French philosopher and sociologist Edgar Morin in order to describe the dominant religious discourse of modern France, catho-laïcité. Anti-Semitism inverts the theological scheme of the elect people into a scheme of the accursed people, or the accursed peoples who allegedly threaten the faithful, later the citizens, with subversion and death. We were never finished with that, and its strongest advocates can also be found among Protestants, Jews, and even Muslims. Whiteness, which I think is the best name to encompass all forms of racial prejudices, practices, and institutional formations, where colonial people of European real or mythical descent, both in the metropolis and the colonies, and perhaps above all, in the colonies who have become independent, such as the United States of America, struggle to perpetuate their domination over non-Europeans deemed colored, particularly black, but not only. So whiteness is a discourse of segregation which found its most perfect realization in the biological doctrine of the inequality of human racial groups in the struggle for life. In Darwinian terms, the doctrine of natural selection transposed or continued into the history of humankind. There's also a phantasmatic threat involved here, but it is not so much subversion and damnation than miscegenation and degeneracy. It is a subject per se to discuss whether the Darwinian theory here is a pure scientific discourse that has been perverted and misused by the racist ideologists, parties, and states, or whether it already includes an intrinsic element of evolutionary discrimination in the typical form of a contradictory scientific ideological complex. With my friend Dominique Lecourt, in his seminal book L'Amérique entre la Bible et Darwin, published in 1992, which really deserves an American translation, I tend to believe that the second is the case, that a projective element is there in the heart of Darwin's theory, when the notion of descent applied to the emergence of humanity out of animality is assimilated to a process of teleological selection, even without a purposeful agent, or this mythical agent is nature. Darwin does not himself hierarchize ethnic groups within mankind, but he gives every possibility to do it. Darwinism perfectly mirrors the complementarity of liberal and imperialist representations and already bridges the gap between science and myth. This duality, I think, is logically irreducible. In a sense, these two racisms have nothing in common from the point of view of their principles. Or, to put it otherwise, the general enigma of racism becomes repeated as an enigma of its internal incoherence. What we call racism, at least in Europe, is the heterogeneous combination of two discursive formations, election and selection, which cannot be reunified. To be sure, we know that they were never historically, practically independent throughout modernity. Since the early moments of the construction of the national colonial state the Spain of, of the Reconquista, which becomes immediately the Spain of the discovery of America, the two discourses merged and overdetermined each other. The notions of origin, of genealogy, of purity, which clearly mark the ambivalence of the Geschlecht, the racial sexual complex, are transported from one realm to the other. They allow for the biologizing, I don't know if that can be said, the becoming biological, say, of anti-Semitism, therefore the animalization of the Jews and more generally the Semites, whose anticipated damnation is, so to speak, mirrored in their pathological or degenerated bodies, and the theologization or the becoming theological of whiteness, whose more or less brutal power is linked with the divine mission or manifest destiny of expanding the spirit over the earth. Are there non-Western anthropologies? I don't know, in fact. Or better said, a legacy of pre-modern anthropology that has been recast throughout the history of European political and intellectual systems, when passing from the universe of the ancient cities to the universe of the modern civilized nation-states. Ancient Greek myths were still there in Plato, albeit presented in an ironic manner, or which are transformed by Aristotle into cosmological and political naturalistic explanations, present the diversity of the human species, or better said, the human community, as made of oikos and polis, household and city, which involves a hierarchic relationship between the citizen who performs the genuine or proper function of man and the various members of the household themselves unequal, the son, the wife, the slave, as a spectrum of natures with an inferior and a superior limit. The inferior limit is the animal. The superior limit is the God or the divine individuals. These limits are not absolutely strict, or better said, they mark a point of fusion as well as of separation. The slave, and more generally the manual worker, partake of the nature of the animal. They are largely human animals, animated instruments, as Aristotle writes. The exceptional human individuals, heroes, kings, legislators, wise men, partake of the nature of the gods. This is also one of the ways to integrate the city in the cosmos. But we might perhaps suggest that as monotheistic religions replaced, this is really crazy. As monotheistic religions replaced ancient representations of the divine, the conflictual scenario of salvation and damnation became a much more effective link between the theological and the political. And as ancient slavery was reinvented and generalized by colonization, exported abroad, then transformed into the various forms of forced labor and forced sexuality, which made it possible for European imperialism to dominate the world economy, the limit of animality became a set of systematic practices on mass scale and an obsession for the white man. Election and selection, as I suggested, but this risky hypothesis of the persistent trace of the pre-modern within the modern, or the pre-modern cosmology within modern anthropology, or its reproduction, renovation, enlargement, might suggest also that there is indeed a principle of unity linking a negative principle of unity linking the opposite forms of racism. This principle is man, or the human, the unretrievable identity of the human, which is neither God nor animal, that is, which differs not only from itself in this sense that it cannot be normalized, that it remains a bundle of anthropological differences, but differs also from the symbolic elements which are invented to explain this anormality within theological and biological narratives. Now, to conclude this discourse, which you may have found disputable in the best case, I wanted to raise two final questions which combine historical, political, and ethical perspectives. I will do it in the most telegraphic way in order not to abuse of the time and leave Jacques Derrida a possibility to develop freely what he may wish to say. What these two questions have in common is a symmetry that, again, I can try to associate with the ambivalent use of a logical transformation. I mean, the idea or formulation of the other of racism. To put it simply, I suggest that such an expression covers at the same time the question of which forms of racism come after the racism that we knew, the historical racism, and the problem of what should replace anti-racism as a strategy and a discourse of emancipation from the discrimination and the extreme forms of violence. And I suggest that it indicates the connection of both questions. We have no guiding thread towards theorizing coming institutional representations of otherness tending to reverse humanity into inhumanity, as long as we have no idea of the new kind of resistances that are likely to invent other uses of human diversity or difference. To be honest, I must admit that I'm here strongly under the influence of the partial reading of Paul Gilroy's latest books, From the Black Atlantic to Against Race. What I find striking in his position, and which the last title clearly indicates, is an effort to completely dissociate emancipation from the mimetic figures of whiteness and blackness, or from the communitarian representations and forms of organization which go along with the representation of the victims as ancient slaves, not by denying the history of oppression and stigmatization, but by showing that the narrative of the European conquest, the narratives of monotheism and whiteness, have also produced an alternative cultural history which today crystallizes in diasporic forms of life and hybrid artistic inventions with a higher degree of multiplicity than binary oppositions. In a sense, this could be interpreted as suggesting that the only race that is going to survive will be the white race, except that it is itself no more than a fantasy that will not and cannot gather a large community at world scale. There are no longer Europeans in the geo-historical sense, not to speak of Caucasians. I find it also very interesting in this respect that Gilroy makes a systematic attempt at bridging the gap between the histories and the logics of anti-Semitism and whiteness by suggesting that their victims not claim the same redress, but face the same enemies who belong to the rampant legacy of fascism in the globalized world. On the other hand, there could be a suggestion that after all, the old schemes of violently normalizing differences, theological and biological, that have already passed from the ancient world into modernity, are also likely to become reproduced or adapted in the postmodern era of globalization. A neo-racism, as some of us tried to describe it in the 70s and 80s of the last century, was perhaps no more than a substitution of certain groups of aliens to others. For example, the migrant workers to their colonized ancestors or parents, and a corresponding substitution of cultural criteria to the biological criteria of race. But a genuine post-racism might be something more substantial. it might truly illustrate the pessimistic idea that there is no end to racism in history, the problem being, of course, how to recognize the forms of the reproduction of the same. In this case, it seems that there is effectively on one side a theological tendency for which the Huntingtonian expression clash of civilizations could be provisionally used, all the more since it is imbued with imaginations of theological conflicts, however simplistic his representation of the religious communities can be. This is more than a cultural translation of social and national antagonisms. It is a global and pervasive scheme of the malign other which escapes the boundaries of anti-Semitism but probably includes it. And on the other side, there are the biopolitical and biotechnological tendencies that Foucault anticipated in his last writings in the form of individualized systems of control of reproduction, selection of individuals according to the social functions that they ought to perform, which maximizes intent on maximizing efficiency of the human material and minimizing the moral, sanitary, psychiatric risks, and so on. Where the genealogical, therefore the communitarian element is represented by the genetic selection of individuals, which goes along with an exhausting knowledge, or as exhaustive knowledge of their ancestry. There is little doubt to me that such controls will in fact target or discriminate massively the poor, the wretched of the earth. If we believe that the combination of secularized theology and imaginary biology has powerfully contributed to associate the racial and racist discourses with the history of the national social colonial state, we may imagine that the post-racist repetitions of the same basic anthropological schemes will powerfully contribute to the continuation, even at a bigger scale, of the same political structures, perhaps continental powers. But perhaps this does not prevent us from thinking that the time of the effective categorizations of groups into homogeneous races, cultures, or genealogies is over. In that case, the vindication of equal rights, equal dignity would remain as crucial as it ever was, but the modalities of subjectivation, or to borrow Anne Stoller's superb expression and expand its meaning a little bit, the modalities for the education of desire would be profoundly different. Thank you.